Before we explore today's case, a huge thank you for the sponsor of this video, Skillshare. Skillshare is a fantastic online community with thousands of inspiring courses for creative, curious people, which I'm sure will satisfy you no end. Of course, there are no ads, and it is tailored specifically for learning. Currently, I'm really enjoying a course called Creative Writing, Crafting Personal Essays of Impact by Roxanne Gay, which has encouraged me to further explore and improve the writing of my cases. With a Skillshare membership, you can connect with fellow creatives, popular teachers, and personally, I feel that there's a great sense of community. Also, it's very affordable, as it costs around $10 a month with an annual subscription. Make sure to check out Skillshare, as the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial to Skillshare, so you can start exploring your creativity today. Today we are looking at a case from the early 20th century, so sit back as we go to Australia. Martha Rendell was born on the 10th of August 1871 in Hope Valley, which today is a suburb of the city of Adelaide in South Australia. Not much is known about her early life, but she was born into a poor family and left home at the age of 16. She would have received some education, as the country passed a new Education Act in 1875, which made it compulsory for children between the ages of 7 and 13 to attend school. Life was difficult for many poor families in late 19th century Australia. Following years of economic growth, the country fell into depression in the 1890s. Overseas investment dropped and unemployment significantly increased. Relief societies were formed to distribute aid to poor and needy families. In 1893, the Commercial Bank of Australia, one of the country's largest banks, suspended its operations, and this was followed by many other financial institutions. During 1892 and 1893, GDP fell by 17%. The conditions that many families endured were very bad, and many men left their wives and children to seek work in other parts of the country. During this time, Martha lived in particularly poor circumstances. She worked as a domestic servant and had already given birth to 3 illegitimate children. She was not someone who was embraced by her community, and many considered her to be an unprincipled lady. One of her neighbours was a gentleman named Thomas Nichols Morris, a married man with children of his own. People noticed that Thomas seemed to pay Martha quite a bit of attention, and soon rumours spread throughout the neighbourhoods that Mr. Thomas Nichols Morris and Miss Martha Rendell were involved in an improper relationship. Martha had always had an unenviable reputation, and Thomas's wife Sarah begged her husband to stop bringing such scandal and shame onto the family. Thomas, however, seemed unable to stop himself. His affair with Martha had been going on a good while, but he was aware that it had become the subject of local gossip, which caused his wife much distress. Eventually, in 1900, he agreed to leave Adelaide and travel nearly 1,700 miles to start a new life with Sarah and the children in Perth. Perth was an exciting place to be at the beginning of the 20th century. Its streets were lined with elaborately styled buildings, and new suburbs had encircled the city. Department stores had opened, and in September 1899, the first electric tram service had commenced operation. The family seemed happy. No one knew them, so they could start their life in total anonymity. Sarah hoped that they would be able to put their past behind them. Thomas found work, the children went to school, and his wife made new friends. She was no longer subjected to her neighbours whispering to each other as they walked past her in the streets. But her contentment stopped when she learned that Martha had abandoned her children in Adelaide and made the long journey west to Perth. Martha found employment as a domestic servant in a house of a wealthy family, but she soon started to pursue Thomas once more. Somewhat inevitably, their relationship resumed. In April 1906, unable to put up with Thomas's infidelities any longer, Sarah separated from her husband. Divorce at the time was rare and expensive, and still considered something that respectable people should not consider. Thomas was granted custody of the couple's 5 youngest children and set up home with Martha. Not wanting to be recognised, they moved to the east of the city. Martha had at last got what she desired. Although not married to Thomas, she would now be considered as the wife of Mr. Thomas Nichols Morris. She insisted that the children refer to her as mother, and the couple presented themselves as a happy and respectable family. The realities of living in very poor conditions, bringing up 5 stepchildren, and a husband in name only who worked long hours and often away from the city, soon started to have its effect on Martha. She had very few friends and spent her days cleaning and cooking. She often felt the prying eyes of the neighbours on her and wanted to keep up the pretense of a happy, loving family. She would politely smile at the people she passed when going to the shops, but never wanted to get involved in conversations. She knew that if the secret of her true circumstances was revealed, it would be considered a scandal, and she would again be the subject of much neighbourhood gossip. In 1907, there was a diphtheria outbreak in Perth. A disease that causes convulsions, vomiting and diarrhoea was often fatal. It was well known that diphtheria had caused the death of one of Queen Victoria's own daughters, Princess Alice, in 1878, and had also taken Princess Alice's young daughter Marie. The Perth hospitals were full, and the outbreak had quickly spread to the poor, run-down areas of the city. The youngest 4 of Martha's stepchildren, Olive, Annie, George and Arthur, were all very poorly with diphtheria. A doctor was summoned, named Dr. Cuthbert. He knew what the problem was as soon as he entered the house. His days were mostly spent visiting patients who had contracted the disease. He prescribed the usual medication of tonics and a substance that needed to be swabbed on the back of the throat. The children did not like this treatment. They complained it left them in much pain, and they found it difficult to talk. Martha spent her days caring for them. It seemed as if she never left their bedside. But on the 28th of July 1907, Annie died. Dr. Cuthbert attributed her death to cardiac weakness. By August, the worst of the pandemic was over, and the children had somewhat recovered. Thomas considered that this was due to the care shown to them by Martha. However, shortly afterwards, Olive, George and Arthur were diagnosed with typhoid. Typhoid was well known to the doctors in Perth. In the 1890s, it had spread through the Western Australian goldfields. At the time, nearly 2,000 people in Western Australia were officially recorded as dying from typhoid, although it was believed that the actual number was far greater. Already weakened from her struggle with diphtheria, young Olive, who was only 5 years old, died in October 1907. Although Martha had never been forthcoming in trying to befriend her neighbours, they rallied round and offered her assistance. The small community looked out for one another, especially in such unfortunate times. The fortunes of Martha's stepchildren, however, was not about to change. In June 1908, Arthur started to suffer with vomiting and diarrhoea. Martha would swab his throat. She believed it to be a tried and trusted remedy, but each time she did, he would complain that he felt worse. Nevertheless, she continued to do it. It became apparent that Arthur's condition was not improving. Dr. Cuthbert visited the child and provided medication to assist with his recovery, but they did not seem to have any effect. In fact, his condition began to deteriorate, so much so that on the 6th of October 1908, he died. Dr. Cuthbert was concerned about the strange circumstances in which Arthur Morris had died and requested permission to perform an autopsy. Martha agreed, but only if she could be present. After a while, she asked if the doctors would stop. Nothing suspicious had been found, so Dr. Cuthbert brought the procedures to a close. In April 1909, George Morris was reported missing. Neighbours wondered where he was, and when they asked Martha, she was very evasive with her answers. Eventually, they contacted the police. Detective Sergeant Harry Mann was given instructions to try and locate the child, and it did not take long for him to discover that George Morris had run away to his mother's house. Detective Sergeant Mann and Constable Lamond visited the home of Sarah Morris. and listened as George told them a macabre tale of how his stepmother had killed his brother and sisters by swabbing their throats with spirit of salts, and was trying to do the same to him. The police investigated the boy's claims and spoke to Martha's neighbours, one of whom told them that he had often heard the children screaming when their mother had been swabbing their throats with some sort of medication. He also said that he had seen her laughing while she sat on her rocking chair. He told the detective that she seemed to get some sort of pleasure from the children's suffering while she was swaying back and forth in the chair. They did not see much evidence against Martha. The testimony of a teenage boy who disliked his stepmother, and a neighbour saying he saw her administer medicine to the children and sit in her rocking chair. Further investigations revealed that Martha had indeed purchased large amounts of spirit of salts during the period of the children's illness. Strangely, however, she had not purchased any since Arthur had died on the 6th of October 1908. Detective Sergeant Mann was given permission to exhume the bodies of Anne, Olive and Arthur Morris. The post-mortem revealed that they had suffered from burning in the stomach, ulceration of the bowels, and hemorrhage. There was also evidence that diluted hydrochloric acid had been administered, as it was found on the throat tissue of all three children. At the time, hydrochloric acid was often known as spirit of salts. There was, however, no scientific evidence which could show the effect of swabbing the throat with spirit of salts, so the authorities decided to conduct some tests on rabbits and guinea pigs, the results of which showed that the animals had very similar symptoms to those found from the autopsies. This was considered sufficient evidence to charge Martha Rendell and her common-law husband Thomas Nichols Morris with murder. The Morris home was opened, and items from it were auctioned in order to try and get enough money to pay for the defence. However, only a small amount was raised, as the property had already been broken into, and people had taken away their own macabre souvenirs. There was much public interest in the trial, but most of the residents of Perth had decided that Martha was guilty before her case even came to court. She was portrayed as someone of low moral standing, a deceitful and unpleasant woman who was unmarried and who put on a charade to try and hide her immoral behaviour. The trial began in September 1909. The picture painted by the prosecution of Martha was one of a wicked stepmother who murdered her stepchildren so she could be alone with their father, a man she had relentlessly pursued across Australia and was determined to have to herself, regardless of what she had to do to have him. The case against her was not strong, but the prosecution knew that public sentiment against her certainly was. They told the court that Martha was someone who never seemed to embrace the local community where she lived, had taken another woman's husband, then made the poor woman's children call her mother. Martha pleaded not guilty. She claimed that she had only ever treated the children for diphtheria and then typhoid. Although Dr. Cuthbert had visited the children on occasions, a doctor was expensive for the poorer in society, so home remedies were common practice. Dr. Cuthbert did, however, testify that whenever he visited the impoverished dwelling that Martha shared with Mr. Thomas Nichols Morris and his children, he had always considered her a caring and devoted mother who cared for the children despite the risk to her own health. It seemed strange that Martha would care so well for her stepchildren, knowing that they were suffering from a disease that was fatal to so many at the time. Surely, if she really wanted them dead, she would have let nature take its course and try not to nurse them back to health. Hydrochloric acid was a very strong substance, which can cause death almost instantly. How would Martha have known how much to administer each time if she was slowly trying to poison the children? The autopsy conducted on Arthur Morris in 1908 also did nothing to aid Martha's defence. The fact that she had insisted that the doctors stop the procedure before they had finished was portrayed to the court to look like she had something to hide. With only a small amount raised from the sale of the items from her house, Martha's lawyers were unable to conduct a rigorous defence. No character witnesses were produced for either defendant, and the lawyers failed to diligently cross-examine the witnesses. They were able to inform the courts that Thomas Nichols Morris spent much time working away from the home, and it was Martha who had the main responsibility for looking after the children. When the trial ended, Thomas was acquitted, but Martha Rendell was found guilty of murder. The jury made no recommendation for mercy, and the judge sentenced her to death. There were the customary appeals. Some people thought the evidence far too weak for her to receive the death penalty, but the majority of the public believed her to be guilty of the most terrible of crimes. No appeals were granted, and the sentence was not commuted. On the 6th of October 1909, in some strange coincidence, exactly 1 year since the death of her stepson Arthur, and just 20 days after the guilty verdict, Martha Rendell was hanged at Fremantle Prison. It is said that Martha Rendell still haunts the prison in the form of a ghostly apparition of her face that looks out from a stained glass window. To this day, there are many who believe Martha to be innocent of the crimes for which she was hanged. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have. It'd be very interesting to know if you think that Martha Rendell was innocent or guilty of the crimes for which she was hanged. And hopefully you'll all be back next Monday for the next brief case.